You think you know someone, right? You build a life together, face struggles, share dreams, and then one day they're just gone. What would you do if your partner left you, not just emotionally, but physically? If they chose a different life, leaving behind not only you but the family you built together? This is my story, a journey through betrayal, heartbreak, and the unexpected strength it takes to rebuild when your world falls apart. Stick with me, because by the end, you'll understand how even the darkest moments can light the way forward. It began with a silence I couldn't quite place. At first, it was the kind of quiet that lingers when two people are just tired. But then, it grew. Conversations became clipped exchanges, smiles were fewer, and laughter, our laughter, felt like a relic from another life. I'd catch myself studying her face during dinner, searching for that spark that once seemed eternal. It wasn't gone overnight, but it was fading, piece by piece, replaced by something I didn't understand. I told myself it was normal, that all couples go through this. Yet, as weeks turned into months, the void between us became harder to ignore. She'd retreat into her world of emails and to-do lists, while I'd sit, fingers tapping aimlessly on my phone, hoping she'd look up, say something, anything. It felt like standing in a crowded room, screaming, and no one even glancing your way. Nights were the hardest. She'd roll away before I could reach out, and I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what I'd done wrong. It wasn't anger or even resentment, just a hollowness I couldn't shake. The bed felt colder, larger, like it belonged to strangers. I kept thinking, this isn't how it's supposed to be. We were better than this.
Weren't we?
I started noticing the little things I'd never noticed before, how she avoided eye contact, the way she hesitated when I asked about her day. There was a distance growing that words couldn't bridge. And yet, I kept hoping that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back. Little did I know, the silence was only the beginning. I never imagined she'd change her mind about children. From the start, she'd been firm. Kids weren't in the cards for us, and I accepted it. But one evening, out of nowhere, she brought it up. Her voice was calm, almost detached, as she mentioned how she'd been rethinking things. At first, I didn't believe her. Could this really be what she wanted? Or was she searching for something to fill the void between us? I didn't ask, afraid the answer would unsettle me. We threw ourselves into it with an energy I hadn't seen in her for years. There were charts, appointments, plans. It felt like a project she was determined to complete. But when things didn't happen right away, the cracks started to show. Every month that passed brought disappointment and frustration, and though I tried to stay hopeful, her despondency was impossible to ignore. Then came the losses. Quiet moments of grief that we didn't know how to share. She'd sit on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, while I paced the room, trying to find the right words to say. Nothing felt adequate. Each loss took more out of her, of us, until it seemed like we were barely holding on. Still, she pushed forward, determined to make this work. And then, after what felt like a lifetime, it happened. The doctor smiled as he pointed at the screen, two little hearts beating steadily.
Twins. For a moment, everything felt right.
She cried, and I held her, overwhelmed by the magnitude of it all. But even in that joy, there was a flicker of fear, a feeling that this happiness might come with a cost. The twins came early, far earlier than anyone expected. I remember the sterile smell of the hospital, the hurried whispers of doctors, and the way her hand trembled in mine. There wasn't time to process it all. One moment we were preparing for months ahead, and the next, we were thrust into a world of incubators and beeping monitors. Seeing them so small, so fragile, was equal parts awe-inspiring and terrifying. Her face was pale, etched with guilt she refused to voice, though I saw it in her eyes. The days blurred into nights as we sat in that neonatal unit, watching over them like sentinels. She blamed herself, I could tell. She glanced down at her phone, emails from work still pouring in, and muttered that maybe if she'd taken it easier, things would have been different. I wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, but the words never felt like enough. Her guilt hung heavy in the air, unspoken yet suffocating. Every milestone felt monumental. The first time they breathed without assistance, the first time we were allowed to touch them through the incubator walls, it was like holding hope in our hands. Yet, the joy was fleeting. There was always another test, another worry, another sleepless night wondering if they'd make it through. She withdrew further, her smiles growing more forced, as though she didn't believe she deserved them. I'd catch her standing by their incubators late at night, tears streaking her cheeks as she whispered apologies they couldn't hear. I didn't know how to reach her, how to tell her that our pain was shared, that we could carry it together. Instead, I stayed silent, afraid that saying the wrong thing might break what little we had left. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of a much harder fight. When we finally brought the twins home, I thought the worst was behind us. But something was different. She was different. At first, I chalked it up to exhaustion. After all, who wouldn't be overwhelmed caring for two tiny miracles? But soon, I noticed she wasn't just tired.
She was distant.
She'd sit for hours staring out the window while the babies cried in the next room. I'd call her name, and it was like she couldn't hear me. I started taking on more, not out of frustration, but because I had to. Diapers, feedings, midnight rocking sessions. It became my routine. She'd disappear for long stretches, hiding in the bedroom or the bathroom, and when she returned, her eyes were red. I didn't press her. I told myself she just needed time. But deep down, I knew this wasn't something time could fix.
The cracks grew wider.
She barely touched the babies, and when she did, it was with a hesitancy that broke my heart. I'd catch her staring at them with a mix of longing and fear, as though they were strangers she didn't know how to love. It wasn't anger or rejection, it was a deep, unshakable sadness that neither of us knew how to navigate. I'd sit by her side at night, hoping she'd say something, anything, to let me in. But she stayed silent, her pain buried beneath layers I couldn't reach. The house felt heavier with each passing day, the joy of having our children overshadowed by this invisible weight. I told myself we could weather it, that she just needed more support.
But I was wrong, so wrong.
The tension in our house was like a coiled spring, ready to snap at any moment. Between the crying twins, the sleepless nights, and the ever-growing pile of bills, I felt like I was drowning. And her, she was slipping further away, locked in a world I couldn't enter. I'd try to talk to her, but every conversation turned into an argument. She'd accuse me of not understanding her, and I'd fire back that I was doing everything on my own. There were moments when I couldn't hide my resentment. I'd glance at her sitting on the couch, lost in her thoughts, while I juggled bottles and burp cloths. I hated myself for feeling this way, but it was there, festering beneath the surface. And when I'd finally explode, her reaction wasn't anger, it was emptiness. She'd just look at me, her eyes hollow, as if nothing I said could hurt her more than she already hurt herself. I started avoiding her, throwing myself into tasks just to stay busy. The silence between us grew louder, each of us building walls to keep the other out. I thought about the nights we'd stay up talking for hours, laughing until our sides hurt, and wondered where those people had gone. It wasn't just her, I was changing too. The weight of it all was pulling me into a version of myself I didn't recognize. Still, I couldn't ignore the worry gnawing at me. Her withdrawal wasn't just about us, it was deeper, darker. I'd catch glimpses of her self-loathing in the way she flinched when the babies cried, or how she'd sit in the dark, head in her hands, after another argument. I knew something had to give, but I didn't know if it would be us or something even more fragile. One night, after another argument that left us both drained, I sat in the nursery, watching the twins sleep. Their tiny faces were peaceful, oblivious to the storm raging around them. It hit me then, this wasn't sustainable. Something had to change. The next morning, I suggested therapy, bracing myself for her reaction. She didn't argue or resist. Instead, she just nodded, as though she had been waiting for me to say it all along. I hired someone to help around the house, a decision that felt both practical and overdue. The moment they arrived, it was like a breath of fresh air. The laundry, the cooking, even just having another adult around, it eased some of the weight pressing down on us. She still kept her distance, but I could see a flicker of relief in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start.
Therapy wasn't easy for her, or for us.
There were days she'd come home quiet and withdrawn, like the sessions had reopened wounds she'd tried to bury. But there were other days when she'd share small breakthroughs, moments of clarity that gave me hope. It felt like we were inching towards something better, though I didn't yet know what better would look like. Still, there was a fragility to everything. She was trying, I could see that, but the road ahead felt impossibly long. I told myself to be patient, to give her the space she needed. But even as I clung to hope, a small nagging fear lingered in the back of my mind. Was this enough to save us, or was it already too late? It happened on a quiet evening, one of those rare moments when the twins were asleep, and the house felt still. She asked to talk, her voice so soft I barely heard her. I sat down, bracing myself for something, though I wasn't sure what. When she spoke, her words hit like a tidal wave. She'd been messaging someone who wasn't me. My breath caught, and I felt like the ground beneath me had shifted. She wasn't just apologizing, she was unraveling. I wanted to yell, to demand answers, but something in her expression stopped me. This wasn't about betrayal, not entirely. She admitted that she'd been hurting herself, a desperate attempt to feel something, anything. The weight of her pain, her confession, was suffocating. I couldn't decide if I was angry or heartbroken. All I knew was that the woman in front of me was someone I didn't recognize. She talked about how it started. small, seemingly harmless interactions that spiraled into something more. She wasn't looking for love, she said, or even attention. It was an escape, a way to forget the crushing weight of everything she was carrying. I sat there, stunned, torn between my own sense of betrayal and the overwhelming realization of just how lost she had become. I wanted to fix it, to fix her, but I didn't even know where to begin. That night, as I lay awake beside her, my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Could we come back from this? Did she even want to? I felt like the life we'd built was slipping through my fingers, and I was powerless to stop it. Still, a fragile hope flickered. Maybe this was the beginning of something new, if only we could survive the fallout. The days following her confession were heavy with tension, but also something unexpected, a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in months, she wasn't hiding. She agreed to individual therapy sessions, and we started couples counseling soon after. The first sessions were hard, filled with long silences and raw emotions. But amidst the pain, I saw glimmers of the woman I fell in love with, and it gave me a reason to keep trying. We began setting small goals, steps toward healing. Some days it felt like progress. She'd smile at the twins, or we'd share a quiet moment over coffee. Other days were harder, with old wounds reopening when we least expected it. But for the first time in a long time, we were facing those challenges together, not as two strangers under the same roof. I started noticing the little victories. She laughed, genuinely laughed, when one of the twins made a funny face. She opened up in therapy about feelings she'd buried for years, allowing herself to be vulnerable. These moments weren't a solution, but they were reminders that there was still something worth fighting for. I clung to them like lifelines, even when doubt crept in. Yet, even in the moments of hope, a part of me remained guarded. I wanted to believe we were turning a corner, but the weight of her past actions, and my own lingering hurt, made it hard to fully trust the process. Still, I held on, telling myself that rebuilding takes time. Deep down, though, I knew the journey was far from over. I came home one evening to find the house eerily quiet. At first, I thought she was out running an errand, but as I walked from room to room, a strange heaviness settled over me. Her things were gone. Clothes, toiletries, even the little knickknacks she kept by the bed. A note sat on the kitchen table, but it didn't explain much. Just a few lines about needing space, about being unable to breathe here. My hands shook as I read it over and over, trying to understand what had just happened. The twins stirred in their cribs, pulling me back to reality. I wanted to break down, to let the weight of her absence crush me, but I couldn't. They needed me, and I wasn't about to let them feel the void she left behind. I stumbled through the next few days in a fog, keeping up with feedings, baths, and bedtime routines, all while pretending everything was fine. Inside, though, I was unraveling. I replayed everything in my mind, searching for clues. Had she planned this all along? Or was it a spur-of-the-moment decision born out of desperation? The twins' first giggles, their tiny milestones, I thought those had been signs of hope. Now, they felt like distant memories. The silence in the house was deafening, and every time I walked past the empty closet, it was like being punched in the gut all over again. Part of me wanted to be angry, but most of all I was scared of what this meant for her, for us, for the kids. I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't just about us falling apart. It felt bigger, darker, like something was slipping through her fingers that none of us could catch. And even though I wanted to believe she'd come back, a nagging voice in my head whispered otherwise. The call came on a gray morning, one of those days where everything already felt heavy. At first, I didn't recognize the voice on the other end. Then, the words hit me like a freight train. She was gone, an overdose, they said. My knees buckled, and the world seemed to tilt. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. All I could think about was her laugh, the way she used to hum when cooking, and the thousands of things I'd never get to say to her. In the days that followed, I walked around in a daze, trying to make sense of it all. The twins didn't understand why their mother wasn't coming back, and I didn't have the words to explain. I blamed myself. If I'd just noticed the signs earlier, pushed harder, loved better, maybe things would have been different. But the truth was, I'd seen her slipping for a long time and hadn't known how to stop it. Her absence was like a shadow over our home, but life didn't stop. The twins still needed feeding, cuddling, and bedtime stories. They became my anchor, pulling me back when the grief threatened to swallow me whole. Each giggle, each milestone, they reminded me that life went on, even when it felt impossible. I clung to those moments, finding shards of hope in their smiles. Now, late at night, when the house is quiet, I replay everything in my mind. Her struggles, her confessions, the fleeting moments of joy we shared, they're all pieces of a puzzle I'll never fully understand. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that healing doesn't come from answers. It comes from moving forward, one step at a time, for the sake of those we love and the life we still have left to build.
Keep watching our stories by clicking on one of the videos that appear on the screen, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to be alerted about new videos. See you next time.